What's going on, Chess YouTube? In today's video, our boy Magnus Carlsen plays the worst rook sacrifice of all time. I mean, when I first saw Magnus sack the rook in this game, I thought I was watching Will Ferrell drink milk straight out of the carton on a hot summer day.
Milk was a bad choice.
I mean, that was clearly a bad choice, but not as bad as Magnus Carlsen's rook sacrifice in this game. Now, in the game, Magnus Carlsen is playing as white, and he opens 1a4. His opponent responds e5, and on move 2, Magnus Carlsen sacrifices the rook. Yes, that's right. Magnus opens a4, e5, then rook to a3, sacrificing the rook, opening up the line with the bishop. Now, from here, his opponent takes the rook. Bishop takes a3, and what is Magnus Carlsen's plan? Well, he takes back with the knight, then his opponent goes knight f6, and here we see the start of Magnus Carlsen's secret idea. He goes b3. He wants to fianchetto the bishop on b2 and somehow get pressure on that long diagonal. Now, this is an interesting plan from Magnus. There's just one problem. There's no rook on a1. Magnus, what are you doing here? I mean, I have no words for what Magnus is trying to do in this game. Well, his opponent castles, and then Magnus goes bishop b2, continuing with that plan. Now from here, Magnus Carlsen's opponent, I mean, I am not even going to try to pronounce that last name. First name, Nikita, I believe. Let's just go by Nikita. All right, from here, Nikita is playing actually really well in this game. He goes rook e8 and then d5, gaining control of the center. So far, Nikita has essentially played a flawless game. This guy taking the center, castling, getting the rook on e8. Very, very solid stuff so far from Magnus Carlsen's opponent. Now from here, both sides play some very logical looking developing moves. Magnus Carlsen getting his kingside pieces into play, where his opponent just playing ultra solid in the center. And again, so far, Nikita, last name I have no idea how to say, is playing a perfect game so far. But now, on move 11, Magnus Carlsen strikes back. He goes d4, trying to make up for lost time with that horrific rook sacrifice on move 2. Now from here, we get a series of exchanges in the middle of the board. Black taking on d4, Magnus taking back with the knight. Now the knights come off the board, Magnus taking back with the bishop. And here on move 13, Magnus Carlsen's opponent is still dominating the game, but Magnus quite confident he can come back from his rook sacrifice on move 2, which if you were to ask Will Ferrell about it, he would say it was not a good choice. Now, in this position, Black made maybe the first mistake of the game. I mean, up until now, he has played just flawless chess, controlling the center, getting all of his pieces out to perfect squares. However, Black has pretty much completed development at this point, with the possible exception of the queen and the rook, and it was time for him to start taking active action in the center of the board. Now, the best plan here would have been to go knight e4, intending c5 next. Of course, that knight is controlling the c5 square. And once that pawn goes to c5, it's going to take control of the d4 square and push that bishop back to possibly b2. And from there, Black would simply be dominating the board positionally. For example, the best line for both players is going to be knight e4. Then Magnus has to do the prophylactic retreat, bishop b2. And then after the move c5, Black can think about following up with the move queen to d6 or even queen g5 and potentially starting a kingside attack. So that would have been the strongest idea by far, but instead Black goes for the move queen to d6 in this position. Now this move looks pretty logical as well. Black is getting the queen onto a central square, and he can follow up with the move rook a to d8. However, you never want to give Magnus Carlsen any breathing room in a position like this. I mean, this guy can come back from almost any material deficit, it seems. Now in the game, Magnus, the very creative idea, queen to a1 with the pressure on the long diagonal with the queen and the bishop. And now Black has a choice. In the game, he goes for the move c5. Of course, that is one of the benefits of the queen going to d6. It does support the c5 square. However, in this position here, Black should have gone knight to e4. And at first glance, it looks like Black is simply sacrificing the pawn on g7. However, here, Black has a secret idea. If white takes the pawn, bishop takes takes g7. This turns out to be a mistake because of the very strong idea queen to g6. And suddenly black threatens not only queen takes g7, but also bishop takes h3, and that pawn on g2 would be pinned to the king. For example, if white were to retreat the bishop, then bishop takes h3. White cannot take due to the queen's pin, and oh boy, white is going to be in a world of trouble in this position. Okay, instead of all this with knight e4, instead we have the move c5 on the board from black. Now from here, Magnus Carlsen retreats the bishop b2, and black takes control of the center with the move d4. Now the obvious motivation behind this move is trying to put that bishop and the queen out of business all along diagonal. However, Magnus, being the greatest chess player of all time, he has some creative ideas to get counterplay. First of all, he starts with the knight jump, knight to c4, jumping into the newly weakened c4 square. Of course, c4 was being controlled by that pawn on d5, but as soon as black went d4, that c4 square is now opened, and in comes the knight, knight to c4, hitting the queen. Now black retreats, queen c7, but now Magnus, bishop f3, getting the other bishop on the very strong long diagonal. I mean, we can already see Magnus slowly but surely inching his way back into the game after that worst rook sacrifice of all time on move 2. And now in this position on move 17, black finally makes his first critical mistake of the game. So what does he do? Well, he plays the move b5. Now, you don't have to be a very stable chess genius like Hans Niemann to figure out that this move b5 from black opens up the rook on a8 to an attack by the bishop on f3. So if that's the case, why the heck did black play this move? Well, I'll try to break it down for you. In the game, Magnus Carlsen takes on b5. Then black plays the intermediate move, bishop e4, and I suppose this was his idea, trying to block the bishop from hitting the rook. However, there is a big flaw with this move, and Magnus Carlsen identifies it immediately. In the game, he takes the bishop on e4, black takes back, and then the very powerful intermediate move, b6, hitting the queen. Wow, this is the star move of this combination. Now black goes queen c6, but then Magnus Carlsen simply takes on d4 twice, and suddenly, out of nowhere, Magnus Carlsen literally wins 2 pawns for free. Wow, Magnus just turned the tables of this game in like 3 moves. I mean, yes, black still is up the exchange. He has a rook for the extra bishop of Magnus, but on the other hand, Magnus has 2 extra pawns on the queen side, and right now, those 2 pawns, particularly the passed pawn on b6, are going to be worth more than the exchange. Okay, now, strategically from here, Magnus Carlsen's plan is going to involve pushing those queenside pawns and trying to promote. And meanwhile, black, on the other hand, needs to get his pieces maximally centralized, particularly those rooks, and try to prove the extra rook is a bigger asset in the game than black's extra pawns on the queenside. Now, of course, before doing any of that, Magnus Carlsen in this position does have a threat of bishop takes g7. So what is black going to do about that? Well, in the game, he goes f6, trying to block the bishop and the queen on this diagonal. However, this turns out to be a major mistake. Instead of that, the computer actually likes the idea of simply going rook a to d8 more, simply centralizing the rook immediately in this position. Now, yes, white can win a pawn with bishop takes g7, but the computer seems to think black is doing relatively okay after king h7. Now, white does win a pawn, but black has tremendously active pieces. I mean, just look at the queen and the rooks and the knight, and black may even have an attack on the white king if we take into account that open g-file where maybe rook g8 in the future is going to be an idea, simply piling up on that king side. But instead of all this, of course, the move f6 played in the game, and this simply creates more weaknesses that black has to worry about on the king side. Now from here, Magnus Carlsen just goes into full beast mode in the rest of the game. He starts rook e1, activating his last piece, that rook on the e-file. Now Nikita, knight g5, and here Magnus trades a pair of rooks. This is typically not something you want to do when you only have 1 rook versus your opponent's 2. However, Magnus Carlsen seems to think it is a good idea in this position and reducing black's attacking potential. Now Magnus, bishop e3, and for the next few moves, he is simply sharking around, slowly really improving the placement of his pieces, trying to find an opening. And here Magnus finds it. He jumps into the queen side with the move queen b4, and the threat here is simply pushing his pawn to promote. Now black in this position, he panics. He goes queen b5, offering a queen trade. But it turns out this is a completely losing idea, because as soon as the queens come off the board, Magnus Carlsen's pawn becomes stronger than ever. I mean, yes, black tries to push on the king side, but Magnus is having none of it. He goes c4, launching those pawns into motion. And after the exchange on c4, those pawns are just so deadly. I mean, again, black trying to get counterplay, but Magnus pushing the pawn. And after f4, the finishing blow, bishop to a7. And now there is simply no way to stop b8, promoting that pawn to a queen. If black goes rook b8, trying to block, Magnus just takes the rook, and that is all she wrote. And that is why in this position on move 34, black resigns on the spot to Magnus Carlsen. Wow, what a game by Magnus, recovering from the worst rook sacrifice of all time on move 2, rook a3, sacrificing the rook, and from there simply proceeding to outplay his inferior opponent to win the game despite being down the exchange on move 2. Wow, what a game by Magnus Carlsen. Now, before you go, make sure to check out my Magnus Carlsen playlist, just showing up on your screen right now, and I will see you in the next video.